Hi, my name's Simon Dawson, and welcome to this next video on my Switching With You YouTube channel. On this channel, I'll be giving some of my own ideas about the history of homosexuality, and in particular, some of my ideas about how the history of homosexual people like me, have had our lives across history affected and damaged by the teachings and actions of the Christian Church. On this video, I'll be exploring two topics. Firstly, what is homosexuality? When we use the terms homosexual or gay, what do we mean? What's going on? The second question is a bit more contested and complex. And the question is this: if you look at reports of same-sex behaviour across history, then often the behaviour described, either loving behaviour between people of the same sex or erotic and sexual behaviour, those behaviours are so different to what is understood today by homosexuality, then we have to ask, are they the same thing? Are these two things linked? Some people would say they are. Some people will say they're so different you cannot safely make that assumption. And in this video, I'll be presenting my evidence for why I think we can describe that these reports of same-sex behaviour across history, many of them are in fact linked to our modern understandings of what homosexuality is. Before we start that discussion, I need to remind ourselves about three key phrases I introduced in the first three videos in the series, intermediate types part 1, 2 and 3. And those phrases are intermediate types, queer ministry and warrior love. Intermediate types is simply an umbrella phrase used to refer to the whole range of ways of being and behaving we describe nowadays as LGBTQIA. And as for queer ministry and warrior love, if you look at reports of intermediate type behaviour across continents and across thousands of years, they can appear very commonly in two main contexts. Firstly, warrior love, where it is the love between males that gives the companionship and the mutual support which helps them in their military conquests. And as for queer ministry, there are a huge number of reports where, again, people who are of these intermediate types appear to be involved as shaman or priests or counsellors or involved in spirituality and religion in some way. In those intermediate type videos, I describe how these people displaying qualities of queer ministry or warrior love were often highly valued by the cultures they live within for what they brought to their societies. But then sadly, with European colonialism, as the European powers exported a Christian-derived set of new values across the world, those new values were so often anti-gay, and these expressions of queer ministry and warrior love were suppressed and often destroyed. So, having got that introduction out of the way, let's start off with the first topic. What exactly is homosexuality? As I described in the first video, there's been a lot of research on this since the late Victorian era, and over the last 150 years, ideas and insights have changed. Let's have a look at how homosexuality might be described today in a fairly typical consensus view. And this is certainly how I see homosexuality. So firstly, homosexuality is loving and erotic attraction between members of the same sex. I think it's important to emphasise the loving. Too often in the early years, the research was focused on the sex, the erotic attraction, and the love was forgotten. Thankfully, now we're looking at same-sex marriage, that love is becoming part of the discussion. Certainly, looking back at the warrior love stories, it was the loving companionship, the way that same-sex people supported and helped each other in battle. That was what was valued in those relationships. This homosexuality fits into a pattern of homosexual, bisexual, and heterosexual orientations. There's debate about what is the cause of homosexuality. In the early years of the research, there's a lot of fear that homosexuality could be triggered in some way by having an over-dominant mother or some predatory homosexual that would recruit you into their ranks. But more recent research shows that homosexuality is quite possibly entirely natural, caused by hormonal or other changes in the womb. And this has certain implications. Firstly, it's intrinsic in nature and stable through life. Basically, people come out of the womb programmed to be homosexual. And there's also, leading on from that, a second implication. It's stable across history as a biological cause. And so you can argue that people in past history had the same intrinsic homosexual disposition as we do today. Those people in history were homosexual too. But that description of a homosexual person is only half of the story. The person doesn't live in isolation, they live in a society or culture. And that society or culture will have certain understandings about what a homosexual person, or whatever the label used, is or may be. Sometimes that view will be negative, they are disordered or sinful. Sometimes the view will be much more positive. Their love is of great help to the society they live within. But even so, you have this balance on the one side, a person with this intrinsic disposition, and that person living in some sort of culture with strong views and ideas about how that person should exist and live in the world. And that's what we have to study, the society and the individual and how they react together. And this is the fault line when discussing homosexuality in this video. Is it an abstract debate about a construct, a set of understandings about what homosexuality may or may not be in various different societies, and whether that construct or set of understandings can be labelled homosexuality or not? Or are we talking about people who are born with this intrinsic disposition that we label homosexuality, exploring how they live in the world, how they live in the various different cultures and respond to the different ways of thinking about them? I'm reminded of the debate about disability. In the past, people talked about the disabled or disabled people as a fairly abstract concept, but the debate has shifted to talk about people living with a disability, to be aware we're talking about human beings with their feelings and lives. I want to shift the debate about homosexuality in the same way, not an abstract debate, not an abstract set of understandings or social constructs about what may or may not be homosexuality, but rather looking at the stories of the lives of people born across the world with this intrinsic disposition called homosexuality, and how they lived their lives in the different cultures and how they responded to the different sets of understandings about what homosexuality may or may not be. So having said that, I'm going to bring you 3 different case studies about homosexual people living their lives in different parts of the world. And the first study is my own life, growing up over the last 68 years in England as a homosexual man. I went to school in Oxford, England, back in the 60s and 70s, where things are very different to how they are today. Just as an example, homosexuality was only made legal in England in 1967, the year I started at an all-boys secondary school, aged 11. About age 14, I became aware of what homosexuality was as a concept, and also aware that I was, quote, one of them. But because of the atmosphere of the day, I kept it to myself and did nothing about it. After school and college, I joined the Royal Navy, and although homosexuality had been made legal in civilian life, it was still unlawful in the armed forces, and so I stayed in the closet and celibate. I enjoyed my job and did fairly well, but I found that the one effect of that being in the closet was a sort of uncertainty and lack of self-confidence in my emotional state. And that uncertainty and lack of self-confidence can be a handicap if your day job is as the senior operations officer of a nuclear submarine. It basically stopped working for me. So at the age of 31, I left the Royal Navy to start a new life. The 30s, transition and healing. I thought I'd leave the Navy one day and meet Prince Charming the next. That's not how it works. If you go to sea for 3 months amongst 100 men, you bury your being gay a long way down. It took 10 years to undo that damage and bring things to the surface. But with the help of friends and a bit of counselling, we got there. And then in my 40s, I was able to enter into a healthy relationship and to be out and married and stable. I met my now husband, David, and celebrated our relationship with a church blessing and then a marriage. I retrained as a nurse to find myself the only man on a ward amongst 35 other women and felt totally at home. And just to show how things have changed, even the church, which had taught that gay men were disordered and sinful, licensed me as a lay minister to teach, preach and lead worship, despite my same-sex marriage. I want to make 3 points about this case study. Firstly, to emphasise what I said before, these are human stories. You can't look at me in isolation or look at the culture I live within. You got to look at one living within the other and how they mutually interact. The second thing to note is that these constructs, these sets of understandings about what homosexuality is and how gay people should be treated are not fixed. They can change hugely, and that the change was actually caused, in this case, by campaigning by gay people themselves. These constructs are not fixed, a priori ways of thinking that appeared out of nowhere. They are themselves acts of human creation. We are not passive recipients of these constructs. We can be actively involved in their creation and modification and change. The third point is to revisit those questions we asked earlier. What exactly is homosexuality? And to look at my life story. When would you apply the label homosexual to me? There's no right answer here. Just have a think about what you would say. Is homosexuality a set of behaviours and actions? Did I finally become homosexual one magical night in my late 30s when I got it together with my first boyfriend and then came out and met David and got married? Is it a set of understandings, a social construct, and I became homosexual when I understood what homosexuality was, aged about 13, and began to attach that label to myself? Or is it an intrinsic disposition? I actually have been homosexual from day one when I came out of the womb, programmed to be gay. There's a latent disposition which for me kicked in at puberty and beyond. The next case study is a story of shamanship taken from Kamchatka, northeast Russia, about 1900. It's quite a long bit of text, so I'll simply let you pause the video to read it for yourself and restart the video once you're ready to carry on. First thing to say when you look at this report, and many like it, is that it's hard to say what's going on. Are the behaviours described more closely aligned to what we would today describe as sexual orientation or gender identity? We should not be too reductionist or specific in trying to describe what's going on. Firstly, we often have very little to go on, and often what we are given are the reports of outside observers. We don't have the voices of the actual participants. Like in this case, when the young man imagines himself to be a woman, we don't know, we're not told in what way he imagines himself to be a woman. But going on from that, even in today's modern world, there are no clear boundaries in the various different categories we give the label LGBTQIA. Some people move between areas as they are on a journey to explore where they want to eventually get to. Others refuse to categorize themselves for political or personal reasons and consciously inhabit various different domains in that wider spectrum. And so we need to be nuanced and open and not too reductionist in our analysis. That's why I like the label intermediate types. It refuses to define things too closely and leaves things open. But having said that, what I'm going to say shortly holds whatever label one applies to the behaviours described in this report. We're turning to this case study. The question is, can one safely say that whatever is going on here is linked to our common understandings of either gender identity or sexual orientation? Some scholars say that the word homosexual, a word that was invented in the late 19th century, can only be used to refer to European understandings of homosexuality in the 19th and 20th century in the Western world. And what's going on here in this report of shamanism is so different from that concept that simply to use the word homosexual here is an academic error. The same arguments are used for words and concepts like transsexual or transvestite, which came out of work by Magnus Hirschfeld in Germany in the early 20th century. I think there's some strength in those arguments. It's important academically to be aware of these cultural differences. Not all cultures are the same. We need to study their differences closely. But despite that, I think that refusal to allow the use of the words homosexual or transgender in these cases is no longer helpful. I think it's better to look at the people in these reports and to ask ourselves, do these people possibly, within the limits of what we can assume from these reports, have the inner dispositions that we might label today homosexual or transgender or whatever else in the LGBTQI spectrum? And how do they live their lives? And how do they relate to the constructs that they lived within? The benefit of doing that is that we can see these people as being actively involved in the construct. They weren't just passive recipients of an a priori construct about homosexuality that came out of nowhere. We can ask ourselves, what was it about these people who may have been transgender or homosexual that caused these constructs to come into being in the first place? It's a bit like the problem with the chicken and the egg, which came first. If you look at these warrior love constructs, like the young men in the Sacred Band of Thebes, or the young men in the Zande boy wives story, is it that the customs and practices of the tribe controlled the young men's behavior? Or is it that a few hundred or 1,000 years earlier, something about these loving companionships was so helpful to the tribe that they got absorbed into the life, and then eventually into the customs and rituals, then eventually mythologies grew about how these ways of being came to be formed. So there's a nuanced balance we have to look at in this human story of where the customs and practices form the young men, but also the young men form the customs and practices. Whilst we're on the subject of warrior love, I am aware of an apparent anomaly where I described earlier in this video a pattern of homosexuality which is intrinsic and stable through life, whereas many of these warrior love stories have a more flexible, age-structured homosexuality, where many of the people take part in same-sex behaviour early on and then go into normal marriage with children later in life, while still perhaps keeping some same-sex behaviours on the side. Yes, I am aware of that anomaly, and I'll discuss it fully in the warrior love videos, and also a video called Talking About Homosexuality, which is specifically about that topic. My final case study is this man, Cardinal John Henry Newman, who was a Victorian major and much revered English writer and leader, firstly in the Church of England, then the Roman Catholic Church. He was canonised a saint in 2019. But the interesting question is Newman's relationship to this man, Father Ambrose St. John. They shared a life together for 32 years, and Newman's biographer describes St. John doing things like packing his bags before he went away, making sure he was taking his medicine, making sure he kept dental appointments, that sort of thing. So it was almost like a wife, but without the marital bed. In Newman's own writings, he describes St. John as my earthly light, and after St. John's death, I have always thought no bereavement was equal to that of a husband's or a wife's, but I feel it difficult to believe that anyone's sorrow can be greater than mine. And I wish with all my heart to be buried in Father Ambrose St. John's grave. I give this as my imperative will. And that raises the obvious question, was this relationship homosexual? When discussing this in the church about 20 years ago, I was told they cannot be gay because they were celibate. I think thankfully we've moved on from that sort of debate. But then in 2019, at a church conference on homosexuality and religion, I was told by a professor of history that when I described Newman as homosexual, I was being, quote, nonsensical. And when I asked why, I was told that their relationship existed before the word homosexual had been invented, and therefore I was making a sort of category error. In fact, when I checked the timings, the word homosexual was first used in 1869, although it only became popular a couple of decades later, and St. John and Newman died 6 and 21 years respectively after the word had been created. But even if it had been correct, and there was just a decade's gap between the word and their lives, one has to ask whether such a reductionist view of what homosexuality is or isn't is helpful to modern research. I prefer the advice of a different professor of Christian history, Diarmaid MacCulloch, who describes some modern historians who should have more common sense than to buy into reductive nominalism, and the obvious likelihood that varied patterns of behaviour and various homosexual identities are as old as the human race. And talking about Newman, it is difficult to avoid applying to him that useful variant of Occam's razor: looks like a duck, waddles like a duck, quacks like a duck. Can it be a duck? The other interesting factor here is the place of personal subjective experience. As far as I know, the first professor I cited is straight, whilst Professor Diarmaid MacCulloch is out and gay. And how much might that affect the arguments they are making? When looking into other areas of discrimination, we're looking into contexts like race or gender or disability, it's considered important, if not vital, that people speaking from their personal subjective experience are given a voice and heard. And should the same thing happen when discussing homosexuality? That's why I have quoted Diarmaid MacCulloch here. He is the Emeritus Professor of the History of the Church at Oxford University. Therefore, I would argue he combines personal experience with significant academic competence and credibility. So, to sum up, what does it all mean? Yeah, firstly, some people might say this is an obscure academic argument. What relevance does it have for me? But I think it's important. Firstly, if we are going to talk about the history of homosexuality, it's important to understand what we mean by the word homosexuality. And also, if we look back at reports of behaviours or activities 2,000 years ago, to ask, well, how can we be sure that what's reported there is what we now understand by homosexuality? They're important questions. And also, this is a contested field, as you've seen from what I said earlier in this video. It's important, firstly, that I lay out down my own arguments as to why I'm saying what I'm saying. But also, hopefully, some of you will be inspired to pick up books on homosexuality by these videos, and you'll meet these arguments yourself, which may be helpful to have a guide to what's going on. But all I can do is lay down my own way forward. My own way forward is controlled by research into the cause of homosexuality over the last 10 years. And there is increasingly strong evidence that homosexuality has a biological cause in the womb. Homosexuality is intrinsic in disposition. People come out of the womb programmed to be gay. And it's not just in humans that this natural cause is argued for. In the animal world, about 1,500 species have been observed showing homosexual behaviours, and in almost every branch of the evolutionary tree. And that biological cause has certain implications. Firstly, for somebody who is homosexual, that disposition is stable through life. But also, people with that disposition will be found right across history. As Darwin McCulloch said, it talks about the obvious likelihood that varied patterns of behaviour and various homosexual identities are as old as the human race. And I would add, various homosexual intrinsic dispositions are as old as the human race. And so, as we look at reports of same-sex loving companionship in the Greek warriors, the sacred band of Thebes, or reports of same-sex sexual activity in the Roman pagan temples, it is possible to ask ourselves, do the people in these stories have that intrinsic disposition, which we now call homosexuality? And can we or should we include these people in the history of homosexuality? So we've come to the end of the video. I hope you've enjoyed it and found it interesting and useful. If you go to the switchingview.com website, you'll find some web pages created to support my YouTube channel. On the website, you'll find a schedule of every video I have uploaded or plan to upload, with details of what's within each video. Also, there's what I call text and resources documents. I give a lot of detail in these videos, and in these text and resources documents, I list all the evidence to support what I've said, and also quite a lot of information and advice for further reading if you want to follow things up. Mostly where I can, I've listed easily available documents, books, newspaper articles, websites, to make it easy for you to find stuff, rather than articles locked away in university libraries. For the YouTube channel, as always, if you click on this subscribe button and the little bell icon, each time I upload a video, you'll get sent an email letting you know that it's there. And finally, I'm going to ask you a favour. I put a lot of work into making these videos, and I want them to be seen by the largest number of people. So if you have any friends or contacts you think might appreciate these videos, please do tell your friends. Please do spread the word. And that's all for now. Thank you.